Greetings everybody, welcome to another lecture. This should be a pretty brief lecture as we'll be looking at a chapter entitled Graduation out of Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. The genre is nonfiction, perhaps creative nonfiction. I've never read the whole text. The only time I've ever encountered parts of this book is when chapters have been anthologized. In the other anthology that I use for another class, there's a chapter there. I think it's called the Trip to the Dentist or something like that. They're very literal titles here, and here we have another literal title, Graduation, in which she describes her time graduating from essentially a kind of vocational and technical high school that is for African American students. And I think it's worth starting with our understanding of graduation in the first place, right? Now, what is graduation literally? It's this kind of marked transition from out of the K-12 educational system and then on to college. Excuse me. For some people, right into a career. So it really is this kind of transition. What else is graduation on a more kind of figurative and symbolic level? And I think this will aid us in our understanding of this particular text here. Graduation is opportunity. Graduation is potential. Graduation is this wondrous possibility that something great awaits me now that I'm moving into this next major stage of life, right? And maybe adulthood too, right? Usually we say, you graduate high school, you're an adult, 18 years old, so perhaps that's it too. Now, the next question is, if we look at graduation as possibility, as this, amazing potential, does it represent that for Maya Angelou here by the end of her recollection of it, right? And we can kind of see. I will be going through the text here and kind of covering key parts, but I want to speak more generally to the piece as well. I think what you see with Maya Angelou is, as this kind of smart, accomplished and astute student that she is, as she kind of describes here, top of her class, she's giving this speech. She's definitely a student who has worked hard. She has this, dare I say, naive understanding of graduation, and that it means so much, and so much awaits her on the other side of it, right? After she graduates. And then all this potential, all this possibility, I think she starts to get a bit critical of it all for various reasons by the end of the text here, okay? Again, I haven't read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. From what I have read, a few chapters, it's pretty well done. She's great at prose, which is what we have here. As you might know, I think she passed away just a year or two ago, quite recently. And she was also a poet. Still I Rise. A lot of her poetry is anthologized in some of the high school texts. It's pretty popular stuff, right? Right on page 21, and we are in our anthology, our course anthology here, 50 essays. Right on page 21, first main paragraph, she says, she writes, unlike the white high school, Lafayette County Training School distinguished itself by having neither lawn, nor hedges, nor tennis court, nor climbing ivy. All of these features that make for a picturesque academic environment, hedges, tennis courts, they are absent from this training school, right? So she's already, early on in this chapter, this text, she's already distinguishing between an African American school, what it looks like, versus what a white school would look like as well, which is much more manicured and much more upper class, right, or at least upscale, because we have to understand that when we say white, we don't necessarily mean upper class, right? But there's a major distinction between black schools and white schools here, right? She goes on to say, when she's discussing the girls of this graduating class, there was a sadness about them, as if this old world was not their home and they were bound for higher ground, right? There's a sadness on behalf of the graduating class here. Of course, personally, I think because there's a dependency on it, right? You might have felt the same way about high school yourself, which is, in all that time that you spent there, it was kind of incubating. It was protective. And now that you're graduating and you're kind of leaving that school behind, there's a big bad world out there, and you are quite vulnerable to it. So I think there's a touch of that occurring here with these students. This has been a pretty comfortable and protective environment for them, and now they will lose that protection as they graduate, right? Now they seemed, I'm reading from the text, now they seem not ready to give up the old school, the familiar paths and classrooms. There's a fondness and a dependence on this academic environment here. I think you probably gathered this in your reading, but this is kind of a technical training school, a vocational school. So the whole idea is they are training these African American students for jobs right out of school, right? The idea that they would go on to higher education or higher academic pursuits is pretty infrequent, right? They weren't really expected to do that, especially in this time. Just looking at the biography for Angelou, she's born in Missouri, and some people I've heard have said Missouri is one of the racist states there is when you look at it historically, not current day, of course, but historically. She was born in 1928, so we're going back to Jim Crow, segregation. That's what we're involved with here, right? On page 23, right at the top of the page, she says, "I was headed for the freedom of open fields." There's that optimistic attitude that I referred to just a few moments ago. She does have this optimism that what awaits her will be fulfilling and will allow her to express in a way the hard work that she has put in over the course of her high school time here. I was headed for the freedom of open fields. That's a very positive sentiment that she's expressing there. But again, and I think we get this by the end of the text, as soon as we see a certain optimism here, if we're being critical, we understand it's a certain naivety too, right? She just doesn't know that there are perhaps insurmountable obstacles that will get in her way. And we might see some of those obstacles here in this text, right? At the bottom of the page, bottom of page 23, I remember in a previous lecture I said, let's not get confused with Shakespeare, to be or not to be, because we were talking about a different understanding of the state of being to be. But here, it's mentioned. In fact, there is a student, and I'm trying to find the name here. There's a student who is the valedictorian of her class, which means that there's somebody who's even more acclaimed and more accomplished than she is. And she's a pretty accomplished student. And she does tend to have a high level of respect for this student, right, this valedictorian of her class. And it says here, his speech was entitled, "To Be or Not to Be." Then it says the rigid 10th grade teacher had helped him write it. He'd been working on the dramatic stresses for months. Now, it's an interesting allusion to Shakespeare in these popular words by Shakespeare, to be or not to be. But you got to think about the context here. We're reading about a black girl graduating from her segregated high school, right? And now we have a white playwright, right? About as popular as you can get as far as the world of academics and what has been canonized. And when I talk about the literary canon, C-A-N-O-N, what that means is when we think of Shakespeare, he is what everybody learns, right? You might think about your time in high school. You might think about your time in college. I think if you look at the Moore-Park schedule of classes, you'll see that there's a whole class, a whole course devoted to Shakespeare, and that is totally not uncommon because he is a staple. He is a cornerstone, if you will, of the academic environment, right? But here we have this really popular European white guy, Shakespeare, making his way into the valedictorian speech, the black valedictorian speech at an all-black high school, right? Almost like an intrusion that really doesn't belong. But again, because of this heavy European involvement within this country and the West in general, it's hard to keep those things out no matter what race or ethnic background we're talking about here. So I do think it's very purposeful and interesting that we have Shakespeare on the lips of this black valedictorian. And he has rehearsed it, and he has practiced, and he is ready to give this speech, right? Also, keep in mind, she is not only black, she is also a woman. And so we understand that she has two major hurdles to overcome as far as discrimination and oppression, right? One, she is a black person. Two, she is a woman as well, right? And you put those together, and those are mighty hurdles indeed to overcome, right? Page 24, I'll just mention it, home economics. Many of the girls in this school, and I think even in white schools, if you go back to this time period, were expected to take home economics. I don't think they have those classes anymore, correct me if I'm wrong. They had them when I was in high school, and that wasn't even that long ago. There was a home economics course, and of course boys and girls were taking this class. But what did you do in home economics? You cooked, you sewed, you really did all of those things that a domesticated individual would have to do. And when we talk about patriarchy, when we talk about men being the breadwinners and women staying home, and these traditional attitudes that existed and still do exist, you can see why these classes would still be in schools, home economics, right? Now think about home economics, and then think about Maya Angelou as an incredibly talented and accomplished person. I don't think she would be happy with only a home economics class, and that being some kind of future for her as well. Now, there's some interesting themes. The reason I lectured on this particular piece is because I really latched on to what I felt were some pretty powerful themes here. And on page 24, for the first time, I think it occurs, where we start talking about religion and the minister, and I'll just read this. It's the third paragraph on page 24. And even the minister preached on graduation the Sunday before. His subject was, "Let your light so shine that men will see through your good works and praise your Father who is in heaven." Essentially be a reflection of God, right? Through your good works, they'll see God, right? Although the sermon was purported to be addressed to us, he used the occasion to speak to backsliders, gamblers, in general, ne'er-do-wells. Ne'er-do-wells means people who never do well. Sinners is what we're talking about. People who are vulnerable and given to vice and sin. But since he had called our names at the beginning of the service, we were mollified, which means forgiven, right? But it is interesting. I mean, the minister is just taking the occasion to talk to the sinners, to try to raise up these particular spirits. But it is interesting that this graduating class is kind of lumped together with the idea of sinners, right? Not sure what to make of it. I think as the text goes on, we have more precise things we can say about the involvement of religion in this piece. And I think there's kind of a paradoxical and maybe even contradictory nature to it. bottom of page 24, whenever I see robe and barefoot in the backyard, robe and barefoot, I do get this kind of image of Christ in my mind. Not sure if that was purposed, but I'll just read the sentence at the bottom of 24. In my robe and barefoot in the backyard, under cover of going to see about my new beans, I gave myself up to the gentle warmth and thank God that no matter what evil I had done in my life, He had allowed me to live to see this day. Here we start to see and perhaps start to analyze the connection between God and this idea of graduation. For Maya Angelou, and I would imagine for many people out there who have a religious background, we start to put the two together, right? For her, she's saying, whatever I've done that was not so good in life, whatever sins I may have, I'm happy that God has allowed me to see this day of my graduation, right? So she's kind of putting this notable time in her academic life together with the grace of God, right? And she's very thankful for that. Out of God's merciful bosom, I had one reprieve, right? One of the questions I would ask, and of course I have my own kind of response for it, you obviously will too. We're not doing any additional work on this text. All you are is required to read it, but we're not following up with discussion questions. That's kind of the purpose of this lecture, so that we have some understanding of the piece. But one of the questions I would have here is, can we explain the connection of God and graduating for Angelou? Can we articulate the connection of these two things? Okay? All right. Now on page 26, I'm actually going to read the entire paragraph here on page 26 because there's a lot going on. First full paragraph. The school band struck up a march and all classes filed in as had been rehearsed. That word I want us to keep in mind. Rehearsed, practiced, right? I'll say more on that in just a moment, but I want that word to really stick out here, rehearsed. We stood in front of our seats as assigned. There's another word that kind of goes with rehearsed, right? Everything's kind of planned out, right? And on a signal from the choir director, we sat. No sooner had this been accomplished than the band started to play the national anthem. We rose again and sang the song, after which we recited the Pledge of Allegiance. We remained standing for a brief minute before the choir director and the principal signaled to us, rather desperately, I thought, to take our seats. The command was so unusual that our carefully rehearsed and smooth-running machine was thrown off. For a full minute we fumbled for our chairs and bumped into each other awkwardly. Habits change or solidify under pressure. So in our state of nervous tension, we had been ready to follow our usual assembly pattern. The American National Anthem, then the Pledge of Allegiance, then the song every black person I knew called the Negro National Anthem. All done in the same key with the same passion and most often standing on the same foot. Everything runs perfect. That's what they're used to. The routine, everything being assigned, everything being preset and practiced. But then something kind of goes wrong and there's this disruption, right? The question I have here is, what is the figurative or symbolic meaning of all this confusion that these black people are rehearsed and get flustered when the routine is disrupted, right? And then what we have to do before we can even answer that question is define the routine. Now, this is where, as is always the case in literature, we have to point to the literal understanding of something occurring in the text, and then we have to ask ourselves, well, what does it figuratively mean or metaphorically mean? Literally, what's the routine? National anthem, Pledge of Allegiance, then they follow up with the Negro National Anthem, right? So that's literally what the routine is. But I think to get to the figurative understanding of this, you open up those particular ideas. This idea of nationality, this idea of some kind of allegiance to a country, right? I think if you're being critical here, you know, especially going back to a segregated South, if you're pledging the allegiance and you're kind of going over the national anthem, you are paying tribute to, in a very practiced and routine way, to a country that doesn't necessarily see you as equal to another group of people, right? But of course, all the same, it's practiced and it is a routine that you have, right? And all of this is some kind of machine. It works flawlessly, but here we had a little bit of a disruption, right? Well, what's the disruption? What's the disruption to that routine? Realizing that the routine is not working for you, right? Realizing that the routine is something that has to be broken if a higher consciousness is to be attained here, right? You can't stay dull and lulled by a routine forever, right? There needs to be some break in it if you're going to have a change in the way you think about yourself, your identity, your country, your people versus other people, etc. She follows up, and I'll just read the next paragraph too. Finding my seat at last. Even that is interesting in a metaphorical way. There's your seat, take your seat. Meaning, there's your purpose. There's your identity. You know, take it, right? It's been given to you. It's been offered to you, right? Accept it, right? She states, finding my seat at last, I was overcome with a presentiment of worse things to come. Something unrehearsed, unplanned was going to happen, and we were going to be made to look bad. I distinctly remember being explicit in the choice of pronoun. It was we, the graduating class, that concerned me then. There's a collectivity. She feels like she is a part of this group, and she's worried about how they will be perceived, right, at this graduation ceremony. Bottom of the page is the principal who comes out. And he's talking about Booker T. Washington, who was a prominent black thinker, activist in this time period, right? Our late great leader who said we can be as close as the fingers on the hand, etc. Right? So he makes it a point to allude to Booker T. Washington. The principal's voice is likened to a river that diminishes to a stream and then to a trickle. Something that starts out profound and powerful, but by the end of his messaging, right, by the end of his speech, it's really trickled out to have no significance whatsoever. You know, again, this idea of his speech, right, his voice follows the same trajectory perhaps that she felt about graduation. It's something major, possibilities abound, but by the end of this text we realize that that too has trickled, right? That too has diminished to where she now has this abrupt and perhaps unfortunate understanding of what this graduation is. Now maybe there's a redeeming quality there, but we'll have to wait until the end of the text to see it. At the bottom of, on 27, the bottom of that first paragraph, it states, he said, she's talking about the principal. He said that we understood and wanted the man to know that we were most grateful for the time he was able to give us, and then something about how we were always willing, always to adjust to another's program. And without more ado, I give you Mr. Edward Donlevy. And then, who is Mr. Edward Donlevy? Not one, but two white men came through the door off stage. So, based on the context here, the principal is an African-American man, right? But now he is giving the stage to these two white men. One of them is kind of standoffish, and he doesn't say anything, at least as far as I remember. But it is Mr. Edward Donlevy who's going to give this speech to this entirely black audience, right, of students here. And you might be asking yourself, why is a white man giving this speech to these, this entirely black student population? Well, that's what we have here, right? It says, right in that same paragraph, page 27, the dislodged gentleman bounced around for a long breath or two before the Baptist minister gave him his chair. And I think I know what she's doing here. The Baptist minister said, oh, take a seat, white man, right? The Baptist minister is doing this. Let me kind of get into the way I'm perceiving kind of religion, or at least kind of the purpose of religion within this text. I think it's twofold, and I think it's paradoxical as well. On one hand, here you have a black minister saying, oh, you need a seat, white man? Take a seat. Making sure to grant him every level of comfort, right? Making sure to put himself at a disposition as a black man, as a black minister, making sure to put himself at a disposition and inconvenience in order to give convenience to that white man. Now, that's on a very literal level, right? The minister is giving his seat to a white man. But you immediately have to jump to a more, to a larger context. Is it black people in general who have been giving up their seat? What's that seat? Possibility, opportunity, convenience, comfort, etc., etc. It's really whatever you are ready to support, right? But are black people in general, because of religion, because of some religious understanding, right? Christian, Catholic, are they giving up their seat to white people in general, right? Giving up their own convenience, giving up their own comfort, so that white people can have that convenience and have that comfort, right? And that leads to a pretty debatable question that would require your opinions and your observations and your experiences, right? Which I look forward to hearing, perhaps at the conference this week. Moving on, we get at, I'm spending a lot of time on this page 27, but there's a few things here. At the first amen from the audience, I willed the offender to immediate death by choking on the word. But amens and yes sirs began to fall around the room like rain through a ragged umbrella. If you look at the history of black subservience to whites, that phrase, yes sir, yes sir, yes sir, has a large place within that idea, right? Always being subservient, right? Always being a good slave or servant, right? We can talk about slavery. Here we're talking about segregation. You go back just a little bit before that, we're talking about slavery here. And we're talking about a master class, and we're talking about a slave class, right? It is a part of American history, right? So you have to talk about these things. Now, what I really like what Angelou is doing here is she's equating yes sir, yes sir, yes sir with what other word? Amen. 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 So whatever that word yes sir means in a social context, it means the same thing of amen in a religious context, right? They're basically the same thing. Subservience, right? Making sure you play your part within a system of dominance, right? You being, of course, the subservient class of people. So I think she's being quite critical there of the audience who, whatever this white guy says or whatever he feels like saying, they follow up with amen, amen, which is essentially yes sir, right? It's all the same here. I can introduce you to a term here. It's not used, but Faulkner. I've mentioned Faulkner before, William Faulkner, who also talks about the times of slavery and Reconstruction and having to transition from a slave state to a, more of a modern state, right, with slavery being abolished. But one thing I've picked up from some of his work is the concept of noblesse oblige, right? And the spelling on that is N-O-B-L-E-S-S-E, and then oblige, O-B-L-I-G-E. And you can Google it, you can look it up. Noblesse oblige, which is essentially because, it's this concept that because white people have the power, because they are the master class, they, part of their kind of dignity is to be charitable, I could say compassionate, but I don't think that word is necessarily a good word to use here, but definitely charitable to black people, right? If you got the power, if you got the privilege, if you have the dignity that comes along with that, well, then it is your responsibility to make sure that you are giving to these black people, right, in some kind of way. But that's a very dangerous understanding, because then you're basically saying that you deserve to be better than them, and a way of justifying your superiority is that you simply help them in certain situations or give things to them, almost like charity. And we've talked about charity with Freire, right? So we understand the problem there. So I just want to introduce you to that term. Okay, let's keep on going here. Subservience, right? That's what we're talking about here. Page 28. Page 28 is, I guess this is just the, you know, a sign of the times. It says, Angelou states, second full paragraph, the white kids were going to have a chance to become Galileos. Now that's a pretty important and successful role to live up to be a Galileo, be a thinker that changes the world, right? There's a lot of prominence that comes with a role like Galileo here. It says the white kids were going to have a chance to become Galileos and Madame Curies and Edisons, or Thomas Edison, right? The founder of, you know, electricity for the most part, right? And lights and all these things. And Gaugans, not sure who that is. That's the white kids. The white kids have the privilege of being these amazing things in life, right? That change the world, that have an impact on the world in so many amazing ways, especially in the world of academics. All the names mentioned there, we're talking about academic prestige, right? Scientific notoriety, right? And that is a white man's world, the way Angelou is describing it here. What about the black kids? Jesse Owens's and Joe Louis's. Joe Louis was one of the best boxers of his time. Jesse Owens, I believe, was a star, right, an athlete. What are black students allowed to be? What are they expected to be? Athletes. Not anything of academic notoriety. Nothing of an intellectual notoriety. Black kids will be sports athletes. Now that's an idea that's expressed here by Angelou that I want you to think about in context of what's happening in the world today. When you think about the world today, our society, American society, or other societies, do we still have the same perspective, generally speaking? Not you in particular, but from what you notice in society, that black kids make for great athletes. That's what they should aspire to. That's what they should imagine themselves as. And white kids get the privilege of seeing themselves within these academic circles, right? With all of this academic and intellectual and scientific potential, right? All right, very good. What do we notice happening here? It says, about midway through that page, Angelou notices, she's looking at all her fellow black students, and she says, but to my left and right, the proud graduating class of 1940 had dropped their heads. The proud graduating class of 1940 now were drooping their heads down. Why are they drooping their heads down? Because this white guy on stage is deflating all of the ambition and all the potential they were feeling about this graduation in the first place. He's really putting them in their place, right? And Maya Angelou, perhaps more than all, is reacting to this and feeling this idea, right? Just to mention it, you know, Angelou says, you know, who are white people to tell us who our heroes are? Why do white people get to dictate who black heroes are? And that ties into that question I just asked. When you look at TV, when you look at media, when you look at the movies, when you look at music, everything involved, do we still, if we're being critical, do we still see white people making those decisions for black people and telling them who their heroes are? what they can aspire to be, that's the question for you, right? And I really do look forward to hearing what your opinions are on that particular question. Essentially, we have black people who have to abide by a white prerogative, a white agenda, and a white cultural lens, right? The way white people define culture and everybody else's participation in it, right? All right, very good. Is that how it is today? Okay. She gets a bit morbid and dark on page 29. As she's listening to this white guy on stage, she says, "Then I wish that Gabrielle Prosser and Nat Turner had killed all white folks in their beds, and that Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated before the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and that Harriet Tubman had been killed by that blow on her head, and Christopher Columbus had drowned in the Santa Maria." Everybody's dying there. Everybody who is prominent within a world of African American suffering, abolition, and defiance. I think when you look at Gabrielle Prosser and Nat Turner, don't know who Prosser is, don't really know who Turner is either, but I think these were individuals who preached a black hostility to white power, right? You don't just take it lying down. Earlier, we had the white minister give up his seat for the comfort and convenience of the white man who was, just standing on stage. These men would never do that. I think if I'm reading in context, that's the idea. Those men would never do it. But then she goes on to say that everybody dies. Lincoln dies, Tubman dies, Christopher Columbus, who obviously has a major historical part in all of this, in the slavery and the subjugation of Africans, right? They all die, right? Everyone dies. So it's a very dark moment for her, juxtaposed or contrasted with the light and brilliance of how she felt about graduation in the first place. So this might be that kind of turning point, right? Or at least a low point for her within this text. And then she follows up with, very literally, "It was awful to be a Negro and have no control over my life. It was brutal to be young and already trained to sit quietly and listen to charges brought against my color with no chance of defense. Take your seat. We're going to tell you what it means to be black in this country and what you can be, period," right? And it's really devastating her in this moment. It does say that Don Levy, this white guy, is running for election, so he's a politician, right? Just kind of to plug in that information, right? And he makes one promise as a politician to this school, to this population of black students. He says, he promises if he won, then these students could count on having the only covered paved playing field in that part of Arkansas, right? So he promises them athletic potential. That's it. An opportunity for athletic potential, but nothing academic and nothing intellectual. On page 30, this is Henry Reed, who is the valedictorian. Toward the bottom of the page, Angelou states, "I looked up and saw Henry Reed, the conservative, the proper, the A student, turn his back to the audience and turn to us, the proud graduating class of 1940. That simple change in posture where he forgets about the audience, catering to this audience, and turns around and addresses the students who he's almost had this epiphany and realizes are the most important thing, these black students on the verge of their graduation. And he starts to sing, nearly speaking, "Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty." And I would imagine liberty is a very important thing within this moment. It was the poem written by James Weldon Johnson, Angelou states. It was the music composed by J. Rosamond Johnson. It was the Negro National Anthem. So the big moment here is the Negro National Anthem, not the National Anthem, not the Pledge of Allegiance, but this is really what seems to take all the emphasis here. Earlier on, we have somebody has mentioned, "I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul," right? she has to disregard the messages coming from this white politician, right? We'll give you an athletic field. And she has to start to understand that she's in charge of her own fate, right? Bottom of 31, she says, she states, I was no longer simply a member of the proud graduating class of 1940. I was a proud member of the wonderful, beautiful Negro race. You know, we just talked about that dark moment that she has, this kind of low point where she's just envisioning death, right, on a historical level, going all the way back to Columbus. But here she's thinking about being a proud member of the wonderful, beautiful Negro race. So we do have this kind of turnaround here, and I think it has a lot to do with her religion as well, her faith. And Maya Angelou, I think if you look up the biography, was a very religious woman, right? African Americans in general, right, historically, statistically speaking, tend to be pretty faithful people, right? Lastly, last page. I'll just read it for you. If we were a people much given to revealing secrets, we might raise monuments and sacrifice to the memories of our poets. But slavery cured us of that weakness. Here she's providing a criticism of white culture. White people are so insecure that they have to build monuments, right? White people are so insecure that there is this kind of sacrifice to the memories of their poets, and that's going back to the Shakespeare, like we talked about earlier, who was also a poet here. I think that's a criticism of white culture. It's an insecurity that causes them to salute and recreate their own greatness, right? Time after time. That's pretty much going to do it. Like I said, it was not too long of a lecture here, and I hope it didn't go on too long as well for a short piece. Lastly, Angelou presents the idea that black people must be given the right, expectation, and opportunity to be artists, philosophers, scientists, religious leaders, especially those whose source of inspiration is struggle, right? Because oftentimes our struggle is that source of our identity, right? And I just have to share, but my baby's here and he's looking right at me right now as I'm saying this, which is really nice. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you next time.